diet as a seminar class for some undergraduates, which is, also has appeared in here. And the title that Carl and I decided on when he asked me to do this about 100 years ago was Healing Foods of the Bible. So, I thought I would go all the way back and start with how food was actually presented to man. And in stage 1 in Genesis, all foods, all products on earth were clean. And I'm not going to go ahead and read you the biblical citations here, because I do have, as I said a little earlier on, a little PowerPoint problem, and I managed to get it down to 100. And since we're running a little late, I wanted to sort of move along. Okay, stage 2, plant food constituted the initial diet of humans. Okay, so I thought I would take my first sidebar and talk a little bit about vegan diets. And these diets are 100% plant foods, no animal foods whatsoever. And the good news is that they are very low in saturated fat. They have absolutely no cholesterol. It always cracks me up when you go to buy a bag of Ruffles potato chips and they say, no cholesterol, the aforementioned Michael. They're not going to have any. They're potatoes that are fried in the other door, the other side. Other side. We did get it first. Sorry. They're potatoes fried in vegetable oil. They're not going to have any cholesterol. These foods are usually low in sodium and often have long chain N3 fatty acids, which, as we'll see later on, are a good thing. They are also a good thing because they reduce the risk of hypertension or high blood pressure. They reduce the risk of coronary heart disease. They reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes. And they reduce the risk of obesity. So that sounds like a pretty good deal to me, she says optimistically. Well, unfortunately, not all the news is good. So if you actually look at these diets, they are low in protein, and this is a major problem for pure vegetarians. They're also low in minerals and vitamins that are associated with animal products. Zinc, iron, calcium, vitamins A, D, B6, and B12. Oh, so what? You know, that's not very bad. But this also then has high risk of vitamin B12 deficiency, and you can get an anemia from this, but worse than this, you can get non-reversible nerve damage. You can run a high risk of a protein deficiency, which is particularly problematic in adolescents, young girls, and growth problems in children. Anytime anybody has a question, just, yeah.
What about supplements?
Yes, supplements are the only way that a vegan is going to get some of these products. You cannot get enough calcium in your diet if you don't drink milk, without supplements. So you can have high calcium green leafy vegetables, you can have calcium fortified orange juice, and you're still not going to get enough. So you're going to need to have some supplements. You're definitely going to have to be supplemented with vitamin B12, probably with vitamin D. You could eat more vegetables that were high in beta-carotene, and that might solve the supplement problem there. Sarah, you look at
I need ammunition here. Molly's boyfriend is vegan, and they swear that Oreos are vegan. So they'll go through a box of Oreos, but tell me they're not vegan.
I would have to look at that because they're kosher. But I don't know that they're vegan. So if they have some kind of fat in there, you know, it's a little hard to tell where it comes from.
Okay.
But they are kosher, which is a good thing.
Okay.
Yeah, the Nabisco went kosher several years ago.
Yeah. Is it the supplements? Is it the bioavailability of the supplements that is sufficient for a vegan diet? I mean,
well, you'd have to take a look at the bioavailability. I mean, you'd have to decide if you wanted to take it with food, without food, calcium citrate versus calcium carbonate, whatever would be best for you. And a high risk of osteoporosis, which is hardly surprising. Okay, next, stage 3. At the time of the flood, Genesis 7:1-2, clean and unclean animals were distinguished, but they were not identified. And back at the time of the Hebrew Bible, remember that everyone was eating kosher food. Everyone followed the Jewish dietary laws. So we will eventually come out of them, but I wanted to give kind of a basis of them first. Stage 4 in Genesis, both clean and unclean animals were brought onto the ark and saved. Just so you know, we're looking at the giraffes here. Giraffes are kosher, provided they are slaughtered appropriately. Stage 5, Noah and his descendants were permitted all food except blood, and the diet was defined as a combination of plant and animal foods. All foods except blood. These animals are one step away from being unclean, but at this time, all foods were given. Stage 6, clean and unclean flesh foods were specified, and other forbidden and non-forbidden foods were codified. Clean meats were identified in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and they were identified as those who parted the hoof and those who were, could chew the cud. So, who do we have besides giraffes? We have goats, we have sheep, we have cows, we have deer. What else do we have? Elk, yes. I'm leery of elk right now because of elk wasting disease.
Chronic wasting disease.
So I'm a little afraid of that. And when you think of elk, when you think of deer, it must be farm raised because you cannot hunt an animal and have it remain kosher.
Mule deer can get chronic wasting disease too.
Yes, I know that.
And even rancher deer.
Believe me, no more.
It's like mad cow.
Fish are clean animals provided that they have fins and scales. Catfish are not. Among other things, their scales are kind of iffy, but they're also bottom feeders, so they're carrion feeders, and any kind of carrion feeder is not a clean animal. The fowl, the birds that people can eat, are a little bit unclear, and what they have done is that the birds who have a tradition of being eaten, Mr. Chicken, Mr. Turkey, Mr. Goose, Mr. Duck is involved, Miss Dove, are all clean animals, provided they go on to be koshered, slaughtered appropriately and treated as a kosher animal. Unclean meats are discussed in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and you can see that there's a wide range of unclean meats. I have an insect up here, and there are the locusts that John the Baptist ate in the desert, but we don't know what they were. So if someone could come back from an archaeological standpoint and say, these are the ones, then we could eat those. But other animals, reptiles, amphibians, any kind of worm, any kind of mollusk, reptiles, bats. You know, there should be really nothing wrong with a little bat. They're very cute. Alligators. Also prohibited is what's called the sinew of the thigh, and this is forbidden because Jacob's thigh was lamed in the struggle with the unknown force. And this essentially means that, yes ma'am? Oh, I saw it had a hand up. Good. And this means basically that people cannot eat the hindquarters of an animal unless the sciatic nerve and the attendant vessels are removed, which makes it very expensive, and there are not a lot of butchers in this country that will do that. But the good side of that, flipping into modern times, is that there is a huge market of Gentiles for the hindquarters of the meat. Stage 7, regulations forbidding mixing meat and milk products, and these are believed to stem from the commandment not to seed a kid in its mother's milk. It is repeated 3 times. It is in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. And this is extremely interesting, but I actually am going to stop that there because I have about 75 slides on that alone. My first thought was to compare some of the biblical food with the food guide pyramid, because this is what we have right now as our the recommendations that we follow for a healthy diet. You know, people in the United States follow the dietary guidelines, the food guide pyramid. It tells us what to eat, what kinds of foods, how much to eat. But there is another one out there called the Mediterranean diet, which is perhaps a little bit closer to what might have been eaten in biblical times. And we're going to go over that one. Okay. Throughout the region, there was a shared culture of agricultural civilization of farmer, peasants, and shepherds, and a trinity of wheat, olive, and the vine was born, based on the climate and geography of the region. Okay, so this is my own personal Mediterranean biblical pyramid that we're going to talk about today, time permitting. And along the bottom, I have started with olives and olive oil, pomegranates, whole grain, nuts. These happen to be almonds. Almonds are one of two nuts that are actually mentioned in the Bible. The other is pistachios. But I'm going to kind of drift on this to tree nuts in general. We have two kinds of fish here. Cheese, honey, and red wine. So we'll go as far as we can. If it looks like we're going to run out of room, we can sort of pick and choose and skip around. But I did want to start with whole grains. And you can read down at the bottom, a land of wheat and barley, and grapevines, fig trees, and pomegranates, a land of olive trees, and date honey. And the date honey, and although I've used a bee up there and talk about bees' honey, a lot of the honey was thought to actually be a thick date syrup. And that is from Deuteronomy. Okay, I just like this particular slide. We can look at it for a minute. Something more, the Christian side, something more for Passover. This is matzah, the unleavened bread of Passover. This is challah, the bread of the Jewish Sabbath. And this is someone making an Arab bread. I know that we're not really going to include that in this particular talk, but I just thought it was an interesting thing that so many different kinds of bread could come out of a single region. In the Old Testament, bread was the main food of the ordinary people. Unfortunately, meat was very expensive. It was a luxury. A lot of people didn't get it very often. In fact, if you were very poor, you really didn't get wheat bread very often. You were more likely to get the coarse barley. And grain was ground to flour by women using millstones. And I think that this shows it fairly well. They have two women here who are balancing the grain and running literally almost like a rolling pin over it, and it's all rock, and you think about, well, how many little rock pieces break off, and it doesn't sound like it's a very tasty treat. Interestingly enough, in Jewish custom, and I did spend a little bit more time on the Hebrew Bible than I did on the Christian Bible, a meal is not a meal without bread. So you do not have to have your hands washed if you have a meal that does not have bread, because it is not a meal. If you add bread to the meal, it is a meal, and you must wash your hands before you can eat. The bread was dipped in salt in temple times, and when the offerings were brought to the altar, salt accompanied every offering. When the altar was destroyed, the table itself became the altar. And so people continued doing this by dipping some salt in the bread before it was served. This is just another unleavened bread of Passover. We're coming up on Passover right now. These people look like they are ready to have a Seder. You would have a, how many of y'all have been to a Seder? You have got to rush right out if you have not been to one. It is really, really neat. And they will have a stack of matzah like this. They will have a whole variety of green herbs, bitter herbs, salt water to dip them in. So you have everything that you could want there. Okay, this is the bread of the Sabbath. This is challah. It is usually served braided like this, but there is nothing to stop serving it in other shapes. So for example, this particular shape here, this round shape, is typically served at Rosh Hashanah, which is the new year. Also note that there are two candlesticks available in this picture. although it is common for people with children to light 2 candles for every one of their children. And this shows someone who is about to eat a bread meal, and they have a cup that they're going to use to help them wash their hands before they can actually sit down to eat this meal. Moving into Christianity, obviously bread is part of the communion service in the body and blood of Christ. I just want to go over just a little bit of what we call grains anatomy. There are 3 major parts to whole grain, and what you basically want to be eating at least 3 servings a day is whole grain. So we have the bran, which is a protective function, and it's just chock full of things like antioxidants, iron, B vitamins, fiber, phytonutrients, zinc, copper, magnesium. If you chip the bran away from the inside, you expose what's called the endosperm, and that's the really starchy element of a particular grain. It supplies the food supply for the little baby germ, although you're probably going to get to it earlier. It has some protein and small amounts of vitamins and minerals. If you go all the way down to the germ, which is the embryo of the plant, you have B vitamins, vitamin E, antioxidants, phytonutrients, and unsaturated fats. So you can see that there are a lot of things that whole grains bring to the table. Now, refined grains have virtually all of this stripped away. And by law, they are then supplemented with B vitamins. Whole grains, unlike refined grains, is associated with the lower risk of cardiovascular disease, such as coronary heart disease, stroke, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, which is a cluster of metabolic problems, including hypertension, including central abdominal obesity, insulin resistance, obesity, and some cancers can also be seen. What we don't know about this is we don't know the beneficial effects. We know they have beneficial effects, but we don't know the specific components that cause these beneficial effects, and we think that they may act synergistically together to do many of these things. So for example, for type 2 diabetes, it may be that the magnesium plays the major role. For metabolic syndrome, magnesium may play the greater role. Fiber may play a greater role for cardiovascular disease or stroke. The 2005 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee recommended that at least half of the number of the recommended grain servings be whole grain. The basis of this recommendation, and the basis comes out of adults, although it is extrapolated down into children, was that 3 or more servings of whole grain was associated with a 20 to 30% reduction of the risk of coronary heart disease. However, if you look at how much whole grain people are eating, so we're going to look at adults, and it doesn't matter if you look at 19 to 50 or if you look at the crowd that's 51 plus, it is in each case less than a serving per day. And if you look at the number who actually consume 3 servings, it's less than 7% in each. This one here isn't even 5. So people are clearly not consuming a good amount of whole grain. And this is a perfect corollary to the kinds of foods that they were eating in biblical times. I mean, they weren't out there bleaching their flour and grinding all their meal. They were all eating this whole grain bread. Consumption of whole grains improves diet quality, as indicated by something called the Healthy Eating Index score. And the Healthy Eating Index score is a measure of how well people are following the U.S. dietary guidelines. And it was underscored by improvement in intake in virtually all macronutrients like fat, protein, carbohydrates, and all micronutrients, with the exception of B12, which grain does not have, and sodium, which is good, because we certainly don't want sodium intake to go up any more than it's already up. Significant trend was observed for both age groups for increased consumption of whole grain with lower body mass index, waist circumference, percent obese. However, it's interesting that these differences were not observed when cereal fiber was added as a covariate. So, further studies need to be done. Is it the cereal fiber that is causing these improvements in weight, or is it the whole grain that's doing this? Okay, we're going to have a quiz. Carl didn't tell you that, did he? Do other people have quizzes in this? Too bad.
No.
Too bad.
No.
How many of you eat at least 3 servings of whole grain a day? And a serving would be a slice of bread, a half a cup of whole wheat pasta, half a cup of oatmeal, half a cup of popcorn.
Like one of these?
All 3.
All 3 of
You
them.
need 3 different ones.
Every day?
Every day.
And cereal
Three different ones, or
does,
can you have?
cereal does or doesn't count, like bran flakes or bran buds.
Bran buds would count.
Okay, I get 1.
Brown rice.
2.
Brown rice is in there, yeah.
How about like Cheerios?
Granola? Granola, you
Would
said?
it have to be
Yeah,
3 different ones, or 3, you can
I
have
did-
3 slices of whole wheat bread?
Ideally, it would be 3 different ones because you want some variety. But I mean, if it's 3 slices of whole wheat bread, then your hand would go up.
Okay.
The pita bread I just ate didn't have.
No, I wouldn't think so.
Okay.
Even if it's whole wheat, Peter?
Even if it's whole wheat pita.
Probably
Okay.
be 1.
Why not? Why don't you eat them?
We're bad people.
Absolutely bad people.
I think it's because we like the taste of refined flour. We like the feel, the texture of refined flour. So refined flour pastas especially are probably something that a lot of us, it's something that I eat.
And white rice, you used to eating white rice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there you go.
That's what the Egg Center sells is white rice.
Is white rice, it has the bran taken
Mhm.
off of it, is that
Mhm.
it? That's what makes it?
Mhm.
Okay,
But they put nutrients back into white rice too.
okay.
But they don't put the bran back
They put the bran back in.
But cornmeal then would be a whole grain.
No.
Maybe if you had the absolute everything in it.
Yeah.
But what they normally do for cornmeal is take out the germs so that it doesn't spoil. Yeah,
How about flaxseed? If you add flaxseed and stuff like that, that counts.
that would
But how
count, but
much-
that's
how
a
much-
seed, not really a grain, but it's a seed.
Okay,
But it's a good thing to eat.
right. How about quinoa?
Quinoa is a whole grain, yes.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, I guess, are you gonna go over all of that? Okay.
That's the 17-hour.
Yeah, that's the 17-hour talk course.
Is that right? Okay.
Barley.
Well, that's why, because since it wasn't there in biblical times, it's not considered one of the.
Barley used to be considered a whole grain forever, and that's germane to this particular talk here, because barley was one of the things that the people were eating. Pearled barley then, that has a little bit of the outside shined up a little, no longer counts as a whole grain. Okay, we're going to change topics and go on to olives and olive oil. This is kind of like a little taster. Olives were first cultivated in the Fertile Crescent and moved westward over the millennia. There are numerous biblical references to olive harvest and cultivation. It was a symbol of peace and safety to Noah, and there's the dot. King Solomon and David placed great importance, and they had guards watching over the olive groves and warehouses so that they ensured the safety of their trees and their precious oils. Olive oil at that time was the only fuel allowed for the menorah in the tabernacle in the wilderness and later in the temple. When they often talk about the oil burning for 8 days, it was olive oil that was burning for 8 days. Priests and kings were anointed with olive oil. It was given high regard in the Temple of Solomon, where it was actually held the cherubim of the wood door, the wood floor of the doorposts were carved from olive wood. which is a kind of sturdy wood. Olive is a very long-lasting tree. The
They just
Christian
don't
Bible.
get very big, so you don't get much lumber out of an olive.
No, you don't. You do not get them out very big. And when I went to school, I lived, the dorm I was in was on an olive grove, and so we used to walk by there every day. So, Christian Bible mentions olives in several places. It refers to olive trees as the king of life, or the tree of life, and the king of trees. Olive oil was also used as medicine and used as food. Olive oil is the most representative food of the traditional Mediterranean diet, and monounsaturated fatty acids, called MOFs to its friends, as a nutrient, olive oil as a food, and the Mediterranean diet pattern as a whole are associated with a decreased risk of all kinds of illnesses, some that we've already seen, including cardiovascular disease like coronary heart disease, obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and hypertension. So it's a pretty good deal. The med diet rich in olive oil or olive oil alone improves the cardiovascular risk factors, including lipid profiles. So if you go to the doctor and they say, oh, your cholesterol's up, you know, that's a poor lipid profile, and it's referred to as dyslipidemia. Blood pressure postprandial, which means after eating, hyperlipidemia. Endothelial function, which hastens formation of streaks, fatty streaks, and plaque development. Oxidative stress, and antithrombotic or anti-clotting properties. So it does a lot of things. A very nice picture. This is, of course, neither kosher nor could it have been done in biblical times. This fish does not have fins and scales, and tomatoes come from the New World. But I thought it looked rather tasty, so I included it. Take a look at fatty acid compositions of different oils, and if you're looking for monounsaturated oils, which you tend to be, what?
Just duck fat. I mean, who would rush out to the store and buy duck fat?
You can't buy a duck, you just take the fat out of it. I mean, it's God. Okay, if you take a look at this, olive oil has the most monounsaturated fat of all fats. And if you're looking for something that's relatively good, I would probably stop at around peanut oil. Duck fat may have a little bit more, chicken fat, and I think that this is very interesting because when people talk about saturated fat, you got to cut back on chicken fat, you got to cut back on this kind of fat, and the actual majority fat in these products is monounsaturated fat. So if you're going to give the fat type for those fats, it is monounsaturated fat.
But there's still plenty of saturated fat.
There is still plenty of saturated fat. But there's not as much fat as there is in beef fat, cocoa butter, or buttered butter.
Used to collect bacon drippings.
Yeah.
So you,
Cook with. That's probably below butter.
No, that's lard.
Lard, there you go.
yeah, large right here.
Better than butter.
Okay.
Yeah, it's much better than butter. Much better. Hold on to that thought. Yes.
Now, in January, when we had a presentation here, consideration was given not to necessarily what the food is, but how far does it have to come. And so when we look at what's nutritious, should we also consider how far it has to come to our table or not?
A lot of people are into sustainable agriculture right around maybe within 100 miles of where they're coming from. The food tends to be fresher. The food tends to be, some people think that it's tastier. That's not my #1 concern.
It's transport costs though in part on the
Sure it
environment.
does. It costs a lot of money to ship it. I mean, if you're buying grapes from Chile, it costs a lot of money to send it up. But on the other hand, there are a lot of fruits around here, or vegetables around here, that we wouldn't have access to if it weren't shipped in.
Can we not grow olives in the United States?
Yes, we can
We
grow
do,
olives
don't
in the
we?
United States. California is a big olive producer.
But we can't in Louisiana.
It's it's too wet.
But the question comes out is an ecologically sound, sustainable diet necessarily what we need to be looking at?
Well, from my standpoint, yes, because I think that from a public health standpoint, I think that people should get the best diet that is available to them.
Even though it destroys the environment.
I'm not suggesting something that destroys the environment. I'm suggesting that people eat better foods. And I'm suggesting that it can come from other places. You know, the food people are not the only ones who are involved in this, so it's tantamount for other kinds of shippers to have more environmentally safe ways to ship products. The packagers need to have more environmentally safe ways to package products.
No, but it's just the transport. It per se destroys the environment.
Petroleum.
Well, it also matters if you're
Petroleum.
going to ship pastured animals from New Zealand on a boat, which is fairly efficient, versus air freighting in meat that's heavy. So it's not all about that, because there's actually some cases saying that it's actually better to buy beef and pastured animals from New Zealand than it is to do them here, because they have a natural environment and it's fairly inexpensive to ship, you know, long distance in a ship. So that's so it's actually quite complicated if you look at it distance-wise and transportation.
What is canola?
Rapeseed.
Grapes.
Rapeseed.
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 Oh, rape.
Rapeseed.
Yeah, they actually make a lot of canola up in Canada, so that's kind of a
That's a great oil. Yeah. Just
Yeah,
the,
it is a great oil, and I'm going to go on. We can talk more about this afterward if you'd like.
No, that's okay.
But canola oil is considerably cheaper than olive oil, so if you're working, for example, with low-income people, then you might want to recommend that they use canola oil instead
Does the
of
grade
olive
of olive oil matter?
You're going to have some differences with the grade of olive oil, but generally the grade of olive oil tells you what to do with it. So if you have an extra virgin olive oil, that's going to be uncooked. It's going to be for salads. It might be for tasting. You know, you have a little set of dipping out, and then the ones that have been processed again are better for cooking.
you know, omega-3s versus omega-6s. Yeah, that's a big thing too, and you see that canola has a fair amount of omega-3s.
Okay, is it desirable?
Yes.
Omega-3.
They're actually better than the omega-6s, right?
Yes, yes.
So that's
We're
the
going
other.
to talk about omega-3s.
Oh, you are? Okay,
Yeah,
good.
we'll do fish. Okay, those consuming olive oil generally have a healthier lifestyle compared to those who do not consume olive oil. So they're likely to make better food choices. There are no specific recommendations for olive oil in either the Mediterranean diet or in the dietary guidelines, although the dietary guidelines, which is abbreviated up here, DGA, recommends that total fat be between 20 and 35%. This is for adults. But they ask also that the majority of that fat come from polyunsaturated fat, or PUFA, and monounsaturated fat, as opposed to saturated fatty acids. And the sources from these are things like fish and nuts and vegetable oils. Corn oil, peanut oil, all of those kinds of oils would have a fair amount of the polyunsaturated and monounsaturated in them. Other sources, if you go into some of the recommendations for patients with heart disease, other sources recommend up to 15% of energy from fat be monounsaturated. It's pretty steady right now, the recommendation for less than 10% of energy from saturated fat. If you were to have a heart attack, if you were to have high LDL cholesterol levels, they're going to kick that down to 7. And that either 10% or that 7% includes trans fats.
You keep saying olives and olive oil. What do you get when you eat olives instead?
Same thing.
Okay. Except a lot of salt.
Well,
Some.
salt. Remember that you are eating a good fat with olive oil or olives, but olive oil still has 9 calories per gram, which gives it 119 calories per tablespoon. So when you think, I'm eating a healthy oil, that doesn't give you license to eat as much as you want to.
Flatter that bread.
On the other
They're
hand,
doing shots.
3 large black olives have only 15 calories. So if you're reading along in Sugar Busters or reading along in one of those low carbohydrate diets, they will give you 3 olives. We go on to pomegranates. Pomegranates, figs, dates are among the fruits that are mentioned in the Bible, and these are some of the fruits that the Israelis missed most when they were in the wilderness. And I have this up here basically because I think that this is such a nice picture of this little boy who is in current day Israel picking a pomegranate. But you can read through some of the biblical quotes. We have the pomegranate, the palm tree, and the apple tree represented as withered, for joy is withered away from the sons of men. And it's interesting to look at some comparisons on how pomegranates are actually used, other than a food source, between Jews and Christians. So for example, the Jews felt that this was the fruit of the Garden of Eden. It was also one of the 7 species brought back by the spies to show how fertile the Promised Land was, and there were carved figures of the pomegranate were the principal adornments of the columns and pillars in King Solomon's temple. The pomegranate, this is kind of a trivia, in case you have a trivia test after. They're also eaten on Rosh Hashanah because their seeds are said to number, I stress, said to number, 615, which is the number of commandments in the Torah. And it also merits increase like the seeds of the pomegranate. So that's kind of a neat thing. I've never actually sat down and counted the seeds in a pomegranate, but I'm going to tell you I don't think it's 613. From a Christian standpoint, and here you can see a picture of Jesus holding a pomegranate. It's associated with the resurrection of Christ and the annual resurrection of crops. The seeds bursting forth from the pomegranate. If you've ever opened a pomegranate, it's just seeds start coming out at first, and then you actually have to beat on the back of the fruit to get the rest of them out. And it's likened to Christ bursting forth from the tomb. Pomegranates are not particularly popular fruits in this area, and I'm not too sure why. If you look at a half of an average pomegranate, it has 80 calories, which is reasonable. 4 of those calories come from fat, which is very reasonable. Very, very, very low in sodium, 27 milligrams. High in potassium, and potassium is a shortfall nutrient identified by the advisory committee. On average, no age group, no gender group meets the potassium requirement.
So if you were drinking this, how much would it be?
Well, if you were drinking juice, this is with the seeds and everything in it, so probably twice as much. And you can also see that it's a very good source of vitamin C. Okay.
So how much would it be per, like a half a cup?
I would take a half a cup.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But that's probably going to be twice the amount of fruit, because the seeds will be out and everything will be out. It's an antioxidant, anti-carcinogen, particularly for prostate and colon cancer. It's anti-atherogenic, and it cuts back on any kind of disease that's associated with inflammation. So diabetes is associated with inflammation. Atherosclerosis is associated with inflammation. Cancer can be associated with inflammation. There are no specific recommendations for pomegranates, but most adults need 2 cups of fruit a day. Smaller women would need a cup and a half. And if you're extraordinarily active, you would probably need more than that. People ask that you mix up the variety of fruit, but nowhere is there ever anything saying you must have X amount of pomegranates.
How much of the nutrient in pomegranate, nutrient value is in the seeds?
Some is available in the seeds, and some is also available in the skin. So if you actually get the juice, you're going to get some of that skin in there. So that's probably a better deal than eating a pomegranate. I'm going to go on to almonds, and like I said, I don't know how far I will get. We did get a little late start. Almonds are mentioned 10 times in the Bible, beginning with the book of Genesis, where it is described the best among the fruits. And this is a picture of a blooming almond branch. Time for true confessions. Almonds are my favorite nut. So, and you can read through here. We know that in Numbers 17, Levi was chosen from the other tribes by Aaron's rod, which was almond. According to tradition, the rod of Aaron bore sweet almonds on one side and bitter on the other, and actually both of those should be edible. Almonds arose probably in Central Asia, possibly in the Mediterranean. They're mentioned in the Old Testament as a symbol of God's divine approval, found in the tombs of the ancient pharaohs, dated from 8000 BCE. The only other nuts that we were able to find in the Bible were the pomegranate, not pomegranate, pistachio, in addition to the almonds. I'm going backwards. So I'm going to flip it to olive tree nuts. Tree nuts vary a little bit in their nutrient content. For example, most tree nuts are not particularly good sources of calcium, but almonds are. So you'll see a little bit of variation, but from a standpoint of the health benefits you get, tree nuts are a good deal. They're a good source of energy. They are a high source of energy. And I just said that they did vary, but they are also a very, very good source of monounsaturated fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, particularly walnuts in that case. They're good sources of vegetable protein. And in red, I have identified the shortfall nutrients in adults. Dietary fiber, vitamins E, magnesium, potassium, and calcium. And these are all good sources in nuts. And when I tell you you don't have to eat a lot of nuts to get a lot of the benefit from nuts, we just looked at a study where people were eating 1/4 of an ounce a day, and we chose that because it was an incidental amount. So people maybe picked it up a little bit in their cereal. They weren't actually buying a nut cereal, but it might have had a nut flake or something in it. And we really found some interesting things. And I'll get to that in a minute. Just like the whole wheat, they're also rich in phytonutrients, flavonoids, all of these things which are also anti-inflammatory. When you see things that are anti-inflammatory, think an advantage against heart disease, an advantage against diabetes, advantage against obesity, advantage against even some autoimmune diseases.
Asthma. Asthma's an inflammatory.
Yes, asthma, absolutely. Okay, so coronary heart disease, nut consumption is associated with decreased coronary heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and overweight. And we've shown these in a nationally representative sample with people eating less than 1/4 of an ounce of nuts a day.
You got cashews in that figure. They're not tree nuts, are they?
They are tree nuts, but they're not old world nuts. They are tree nuts. The FDA defines them as tree nuts.
They're usually grown as shrubs.
No, or if you go to the tropics, they are a tree and they have a fruit that's at the bottom end of it, and it's actually a nut that's
No,
processed.
they're classed as
Yeah.
a tree nut, as
They have a
are
husk to it.
Macadamia.
macadamia, Brazil nuts, walnuts,
Almonds.
almonds, pistachios,
Pecan.
hazelnuts,
Pecan.
the gun.
Pecan.
Pecans?
That's where I'm from. I'm from Pecan land. My mom made me stop saying that.
Pecans?
Pecans are not, yeah, what you're not seeing up there are peanuts.
Yeah.
Of course not.
These are groundnuts.
Are they not good for you?
Yes, they are.
They're good too. Okay. So there are no bad nuts then, really.
There are no bad nuts. And one of the problems,
On that, I gotta go. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, the only problem with nuts and peanuts is that they are very potent allergens, particularly peanuts. And this just shows you a little bit about the fatty acid. And coconuts, which the FDA does not really define as a tree nut, is principally saturated fat. But you can see the rest of them hardly have any saturated fat at all, and they're mostly MUFA or PUFA. So that's good. And walnuts are particularly good with the N3. I have 5 minutes to run. How long do these go?
One-ish.
One-ish?
Yeah, to one.
See if we can get in one more little something. Hate letting my class out of if you take a look at the fatty acids in nuts and you take a look at what happens to some of the blood lipids. Okay, this is LDL, which is commonly called the bad LDL, HDL, commonly called good, and triglycerides, which are getting to be worse. And if you take a look at the fat going down, you're looking at saturated fat, and remember that the nuts had very little saturated fat in them. Increase LDL, increase HDL, either doesn't affect triglycerides or increases them, whereas monos, which were quite common in the nuts, down, no effect, or up, which is good, down, which is good, the polys down, 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 and trans fat is bad. So for bad it goes up, for the good it goes down, and for triglycerides it goes up. So trans fats are fairly evil. But nuts are a good source of good fats. And lastly, on nuts, I'm just going to mention that they are also good sources of alpha-tocopherol or vitamin E. And these are antioxidants that scavenge free radicals and destroy singlet molecular oxygen, and then reduces should be inflammation, not inflammation. It's difficult to spell these days. And again, it is a short-fall nutrient. And I think that's actually the last thing I have on nuts, and it is. So I think I might have to stop there, and you're going to miss out on wine and fish.
Just give us the highlights.
Yeah, we have like 5 minutes, right?
No one's in a rush.
Yeah,
We
have 5
definitely need to know
Yeah.
why.
Definitely.
Yeah, the wine and the fish.
Do we want another wine, or do we want another fish?
Real quick.
Highlight.
Okay. People were slow moving from the plains to the sea, but if they were actually on the sea coast, then they became fishermen themselves. And fishermen always at this time stayed within sight of land. And you can clearly see why. It was very likely that they were able to fall off the edge of the world. And we all know that there were a lot of sea monsters waiting for them down there. Fresh fish was expensive and generally went to the wealthy. When poor could afford it, it was often smaller fish that were salted or dried. In fact, drying the fish, air drying, or even oil preserving it were really the only things that they had available to them if they wanted to preserve the fish. Obviously, you could eat it fresh. Otherwise, you had to either salt it or air dry it or oil preserve, because there was no refrigeration and there was no canning. Fish play an important role in the diet of Jews. It's the symbol of fertility, since Jacob gave his children the blessing that they should be fruitful and multiply like fish in the sea. But they are also associated with the coming of the Messiah, and as such they are consumed at Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year. The Talmud states that fish should be eaten on the Sabbath, and so it is very customary to have fish in addition to another major protein on a Friday night. From a standpoint of Christianity, the church imposed days of fasting defined somewhat differently than Judaism defines fasting, in that for most of these, fish could be consumed, and it got to the point where fasting days reached about 150 days out of the year. So fish was frequently consumed by a lot of people. Nutrients in fish: protein, polyunsaturated fatty acids, these are the PUFAs, and they're fatty fish in particular, quite high in omega-3s. Vitamins A, B3, which you probably have heard of as niacin, B6, B12, D, and E, which is another shortfall nutrient. Minerals, calcium, shortfall nutrient, iron is not, selenium is not, and zinc is not. But fish is chock-a-block full of all those kinds of things. And, not surprisingly, they help protect against cardiovascular disease, retinal and brain development, rheumatoid arthritis, Alzheimer's disease, and diabetes. There's strong evidence of CDC risk reduction with intake of fish, and studies have focused on fish-consuming populations that have a low risk of CVD or cardiovascular disease mortality. And a lot of this is really thought to come from the omega-3s, which the particularly fatty fish are high in. But it's really not clear what the protective mechanism of it is yet. Recommendations: the American Heart Association recommends eating fish, particularly fatty fish, at least 2 times a week. They define the survey there about 3½ ounces of cooked or about 3/4 of a cup of flaked fish. And during the last revision of the dietary guidelines, the battle went on fairly hot and furious, because one of the problems was, you know, fish is good for you, it's low in fat, and the fat it does have is very good for you. Unfortunately, a lot of the fish is contaminated by mercury and other types of man-made pollutants. Dairy?
I have a question about fish.
Mm-hmm.
What is your opinion of supplements related to fish, particularly fish oil supplements?
Fish oil supplements, I think they're a pretty good thing, or they can be a pretty good thing. I think that you have to be careful when you choose them to make sure that they're pure fish oil, and people don't always tolerate them very well. A lot of times they'll have a little, shall we say, tummy upset, and you can kind of like be burping up little bits of fish oil. Michael.
Well, and you know, being a vegetarian and not eating fish, and the ratio of your omega-3 to your monounsaturated is important, right? So take fish oil pills and, you know, have olive oil, should be okay.
Mm-hmm. Should be. I'm not going to spend very long on this. The purpose of this slide was to show that there were not a lot of cows. The land would not support a lot of cows. And with the hot climate coupled with historical lack of refrigeration, what they did consume of dairy, unless they were taking it directly out of the goat or sheep at that time, is going to be consumed as cheese or yogurt. Dairy foods, and the shortfall nutrients are in red. Dairy foods: protein, vitamins A, D, riboflavin, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. What can you get if you don't have dairy foods? Osteoporosis, osteomalacia, which is rickets in adults, hypertension, weight issues. Calcium and milk is associated with lower weights. Blood sugar regulation, possibly from the magnesium. My pyramid recommends adults consume 3 cups of low-fat dairy a day, preferably milk, although a dairy equivalent like cheese would be good, whereas the Med Diet or the Harvard Diet recommends at most cheese and yogurt be eaten daily and preferably weekly. And the argument there can be, and I have seen the argument in writing where they say that, you know, people can get just calcium just fine out of either fortified products or green leafy vegetables and all of those kinds of things. But we published a paper last year that basically said if you don't get milk and you don't take supplements, then you're not going to meet the calcium requirements.
Throw up.
And the answer to that is no. Honey is the only kosher food that is an insect product, and originally it was allowed by the rabbis because they thought that the only part the bee played in it was to carry the nectar from one flower to the hive, one back, pick up some more nectar, to the hive, pick up some more nectar, to the hive, and then they realized what was actually going on with the honey and the bee actually swallows the nectar, regurgitates the nectar, yes, tasty, packs it in here, and the honey that you'd see in the comb is also full of little bee parts. But by that time, honey was such an important part in Jewish food that they let it go through. As you will. And it's eaten, sweet foods are eaten in Rosh Hashanah, which is the new year, and it could be honey, apple dipped in honey, it could be a honey cake, a lot of things like that. I think we did that. One thing I do want to comment on is that it has the same relative sweetness as sugar. It has approximately the same number of calories, but most bacteria will not grow in honey, so it makes a nice little preservative. There are some examples here. Obviously, the most famous one is the land flowing with milk and honey. John the Baptist was in the wilderness and consisted of locusts and wild honey. This is a locust storm in Egypt. I couldn't find one closer to the mark. And the thing about it is, even insects which are not kosher, if you can find these locusts, you can eat them and they will be kosher. Honey's been used for centuries for sore throats, for coughs, and topical honey has been successful in treating dietetic ulcers or diabetic ulcers if nothing else was available. That would not be my first choice, and it has also been used for other wound healing. I mean, if I were going to do that, I think I would rather use garlic at that.
That's external, that's not consuming.
I know. No, it's external.
The antibiotic type, I mean, the failure of bacteria to thrive, I mean, it's probably less helpful.
Yeah. Honey, however, can harbor botulism spores and cause infant botulism in children less than 1 year, so it is contraindicated in those children. There's also a possibility that honey can be made from toxic plants, and there are reported honey allergies. So people are allergic to honey, but that's often they're allergic either to the bee, the parts that are contaminating the honey, or to the pollen that is contaminating the honey, rather than to the honey itself. And I just mentioned that the amount of sugar and the amount of honey have about the same number of calories. And there's really not a particular, there's certainly no recommendation for honey. The sweets, you can read through what they have to say about discretionary calories. The number of calories each day is about 200 for an adult, and that discretionary calories would have added sugars, solid fats, and alcohol. American Heart Association just came out with a recommendation stating that less than half of the discretionary calories from sugar, so that should be less than 100 calories. WHO says 10% of energy can be added sugar. The Institute of Medicine in the United States says that 25% can be added sugar, so we're not quite on the same page.
100 calories is how many grams? This usually is listed.
It's 18 calories per teaspoon of sugar. So for it to be in grams, I think I want to say it's something like 5 grams per teaspoon, something like that. Okay, it's 10 after 1. If anybody needs to go.
Do people want to hear the wine report? I know this is
Yes,
this was a good thing to close on, so people will stay for wine.
If it's good news. If it's not good news, we'll
Yeah.
put it out.
Yeah, really? That's good news.
Okay.
If it's enabling news, that's a better way to put it.
And we'll go through this quickly. Most grapes come from Vitis vinifera, which is native to the Mediterranean and Central Asia. Wine from these grapes is thought to have originated around 6000 BC. Georgia or Iran was brought to the Mediterranean around 4500 BCE. Old Testament states that wine was first produced on Mount
Ararat.
yes. And You can read through here. It just talks about how people were split off from one another and how they then had the opportunity to bring their talents on what kinds of wine they were making. I included some wine and religion, red wine and religion in particular. This is a Seder plate. And this is the wine that would be drunk with the Seder. There is an obligation to drink 4 glasses of wine and to have one for the prophet Elijah. And 4 glasses are poured and must be drunk during the Seder dinner to symbolize the 4 main stages of the Exodus that led Hebrew slaves to the Promised Land of freedom, deliverance, redemption, and release. So that is why they have to drink 4. Now, if you have a child, if you have someone who can't drink, if you have
That's
other
why Seder meals are
problems,
so much fun.
then you can't drink grapefruit juice. Okay, besides those 4, there is a cup here, with this, the 5th cup of wine, which is poured and placed on the Seder table, and that's known as the cup of Elijah. And it is the offering for the prophet, and they leave the door open so that the prophet can come in and get the wine.
And provide a chair.
And yes, everything. You know, it's he is a guest there. Well, he probably didn't get enough.
You were going to drink that, weren't you? I know you were.
Everybody else gets 4.
And as you know, communion in Christianity. Okay. Red wine health benefits: decreased cardiovascular disease risk, decreased cancer formation, inflammation, blood pressure, and fewer complications from cardiac conditions. So if you have gotten a cardiac condition anyway, you may have fewer problems with that. Resveratrol is thought to be one of the most active compounds in grapes and in wine that helps cause many of these. It acts in cardiovascular, cardioprotective effects, and it is a naturally recurring polyphenolic compound and is an antioxidant found in the skin. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through these. I almost took these out, actually, but it does reduce the risk of myocardial infarction. It does reduce it increases HDL, which is good cholesterol levels. But one thing that you have to be careful of is that there is a J-shaped curve for people who do or don't drink. So if someone is an absolute teetotaler, you are here, and your all-cause mortality rate is higher than if you have a couple of drinks a day. However, if you have
Look at the rest of the curve
a
here.
lot.
Hey, where's George's part of the curve?
If you have quite a few drinks per day, you're way up on getting some sort of liver disease, pancreatitis, esophageal varices, cirrhosis.
So is it recommended that you drink during the whole day instead?
The number of drinks, and what they recommend is, and I quote, moderation, and moderation is 1 for a woman, 2 for a man. Michael?
Per day?
It's higher. Much
Yes, it is higher.
You only get a third of a cup a day.
It is higher than it is down here.
Yeah, for 0,
You
right,
reduce your
right.
health.
But
Because
Yeah.
teetotalers
if you have
The
at least
teetotalers are
4.
higher than
Right.
people who drink moderately.
Now, is white wine the equivalent of like a processed grain?
It's not that bad, but it's not as good as red wine. But if you go into the doctor and you've had some white wine and your HDL is up, the first thing they're going to say to you is, "Oh, do you drink wine?" So that's kind of interesting. Obviously, whole groups of people should not drink.
Yeah.
Children, drivers, people who operate machinery, pregnant women, lactating women, alcoholics should not drink. So there's a whole host of people who should not drink. And you wouldn't want to make a recommendation for someone who does not drink. You wouldn't want to turn around and say to them, "Oh, you'll feel a lot better if you have a couple of cocktails."
Well,
I just Gonna go skip over that slide. This is just sort of a summary slide to talk about some of the foods that were eaten. Grain-based diet, bread, grain, barley, wheat, some fruit, pomegranates, figs, dates, melons, you can all read this, some vegetables. The beans that they had were not what we think of beans, like black beans, great northern beans, things like that. They were lentils, fava beans, and chickpeas. Beets were around, onions and leeks, cucumbers, salt and spices, nuts, some birds, some fish, some meat, eggs, curd, yogurt, cheese. Honey was around, olive oil was around since they made wine, they had vinegar, and they had red wine, and they had water to drink. So, is that a healthy diet? Looks good to me. Are there any other questions?
Very good.
Very much.
The board had finished on time. If we had started on time.